In 921 AD, an Arab diplomat watched a young woman remove her jewelry and hand it to an old woman known as the Angel of Death. The girl was about to climb onto a burning ship. She had been preparing for this moment for 10 days. And what had been done to her during those 10 days was so disturbing that the diplomat, a man who had traveled 4,000 miles through some of the most dangerous territories on Earth, would later write that he had never witnessed anything so horrifying in his life. His name was Ahmad ibn Fadlan. He was a scholar from Baghdad sent to document the customs of foreign peoples. He was trained to observe without judgment, to record without emotion, to write down exactly what he saw, regardless of how it made him feel. What he saw on the banks of the Volga River would fill 11 pages of his manuscript. What he recorded would be dismissed as impossible exaggeration for nearly 1,000 years. And what archaeology would eventually prove is that every word he wrote was true. The young woman was a slave. Her Viking master had died 10 days earlier. She had been selected to accompany him to the afterlife. But she would not simply be killed and placed beside him. For 10 days, she had been passed from tent to tent throughout the camp. Every night, a different group of men. Every night, the same ritual words spoken to her. "Tell your master I did this for love of him." Ibn Fadlan recorded what happened in those tents. He recorded what the men did. He recorded what they said. He recorded that this happened not once, not twice, but every single night for 10 consecutive nights. And that was only the preparation. What happened on the 11th day, on that ship in the tent where her dead master's body waited for her, was something the Vikings themselves tried to hide. When the girl entered that tent for the final ritual, the men outside began beating their shields as loudly as they could. Ibn Fadlan asked why. The answer he received explains why this account was dismissed as fantasy for centuries. The Vikings were drowning out her screams. They did not want the other slave girls in the camp to hear what was happening inside. Because if they heard, Ibn Fadlan was told, none of them would ever volunteer to die with their masters again. The screaming lasted several minutes. When it stopped, the Angel of Death emerged from the tent. Her work was complete. What you are about to hear is the full account of what happened to this girl. Not the version that appears in history books, not the sanitized summary that documentaries provide. The complete testimony of a man who stood and watched because his duty required it, who asked questions that others would not ask, who wrote down answers that others would not record. You will learn what the Vikings believed about death that made this ritual necessary. You will learn what happened in those tents during the 10 nights of preparation. You will learn what the girl saw when they lifted her above the door frame, and she looked into the afterlife. You will learn what the Angel of Death did inside that tent, and why she needed both a rope and a blade to do it. You will learn why the men beat their shields to cover the screaming. And you will learn what was discovered when archaeologists began opening Viking graves and finding exactly what Ibn Fadlan described. Female bodies with marks of strangulation and stabbing, positioned beside their masters, killed to serve men who were already dead. This is not legend. This is not saga. This is eyewitness testimony recorded in Arabic 1100 years ago, preserved in manuscripts that survived the centuries, confirmed by physical evidence that cannot be disputed. If you are drawn to real history, the kind that reveals what human beings actually did to each other when belief and power permitted it, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. The slave girl had no name in Ibn Fadlan's account. She was property. She was a message carrier. She was a sacrifice. She was passed to every man before the fire. This is her story, the only record that she ever existed. Let us begin with how Ibn Fadlan came to be standing on that riverbank, watching a young woman prepare to die. Ahmad ibn Fadlan departed Baghdad on June 21st, 921 AD. He was part of an embassy sent by the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir to the king of the Volga Bulgars, a people who had recently converted to Islam and requested religious teachers. The journey would take over a year. The route wound north through Persia, across the Caspian Sea, and into the vast steppes that stretched toward the northern rivers. Ibn Fadlan was not the leader of the embassy, but he was its chronicler, responsible for documenting everything they encountered. He was perfect for the job. He was educated, curious, and possessed of a writing style that combined scholarly precision with vivid description. He noticed details that others missed. He asked questions that others would not think to ask. He recorded customs that others would have dismissed as too barbaric to mention. His account, known as the Risala, would become one of the most valuable documents in medieval history. It provides the only detailed eyewitness description of Viking society written by someone from outside that culture. Arab traders had encountered Vikings before, but none had left such comprehensive records. Ibn Fadlan's route brought him into contact with the Rus in the spring of 922. He encountered them along the Volga River, where they had established trading posts to facilitate commerce between Scandinavia and the Islamic world. They brought furs, slaves, amber, and honey south. They took silver, silk, and spices north. The Rus fascinated Ibn Fadlan. He was simultaneously impressed and disgusted by them. He described them as the most perfect physical specimens he had ever seen, tall and fair, their bodies covered with tattoos from neck to fingertips. He also described them as the filthiest of God's creatures, sharing, washing water, and performing bodily functions without shame. His observations were clinical, but not without judgment. He was a Muslim from one of the most sophisticated cities on earth. Baghdad, in the 10th century, was the intellectual capital of the world, home to the House of Wisdom, center of science and philosophy. The Rus, by contrast, were pagans who worshipped wooden idols and practiced customs that Ibn Fadlan found incomprehensible. But he wrote it all down. That was his job. And what he wrote down during his weeks among the Rus would preserve details of Viking culture that no other source contains. He arrived at the Rus trading camp in spring. A chieftain was alive. By the time Ibn Fadlan left, that chieftain would be dead, and Ibn Fadlan would have witnessed what the Rus did to honor their dead leaders. The chieftain's death set in motion a sequence of events that would culminate in the ritual Ibn Fadlan documented. But before we reach that ritual, you need to understand what the Vikings believed about death and why they thought what they were about to do was necessary. The Vikings did not believe death was an ending. They believed it was a transition. The dead traveled to another realm where they continued to exist, continued to need the things they had needed in life, continued to be served by those who had served them before. A man who died wealthy should arrive in the afterlife wealthy. A man who died with servants should arrive with servants. A man who died as a warrior should arrive with weapons, with a ship to carry him, with everything required to maintain his status in the world beyond. This belief shaped every aspect of Viking burial practice. Graves were filled with goods, weapons, tools, jewelry, food, drink. The dead were dressed in their finest clothes. They were positioned as if ready to travel, because travel was exactly what they were doing. But objects were not enough. The dead also needed companions. Animals were commonly sacrificed at Viking funerals. Horses, dogs, birds of prey, the creatures that had served a man in life would serve him in death. They were killed and placed in the grave or on the funeral ship, their spirits released to follow their master. And sometimes, humans were sacrificed as well. The practice was not universal. Not every Viking funeral involved human sacrifice, but for wealthy and powerful men, for chieftains and kings, the sacrifice of slaves was documented in multiple sources. The dead needed servants in the afterlife. Slaves provided those servants. Ibn Fadlan was not the only one to describe this practice. Norse sagas mention it. Other Arab travelers alluded to it. Archaeological evidence supports it. Graves have been excavated containing multiple bodies, some clearly killed at the time of burial, some showing signs of violent death that match the methods described in written accounts. But Ibn Fadlan's account is unique in its detail. He did not simply note that a slave was killed. He described every stage of the process, from the initial selection to the final moments. He recorded conversations. He described emotions. He created a narrative that allows us to understand not just what happened, but how it happened, step by step, hour by hour. The chieftain died. His body was placed in a temporary grave while preparations were made. A slave girl was selected to accompany him. The selection process itself was significant. The girl was not chosen against her will, at least not overtly. She volunteered. Ibn Fadlan explained how this worked. When a great man died, his slaves were asked who would accompany him. The question was posed as an honor. To die with one's master was to guarantee passage to the afterlife, to escape the miserable existence of slavery for eternal service in a glorious realm. Someone always volunteered, perhaps from genuine belief, perhaps from the knowledge that a slave's life offered little else to hope for, perhaps from pressure that Ibn Fadlan did not witness or did not recognize. The girl who volunteered for this particular chieftain was young. Ibn Fadlan did not record her age, but his description suggests late teens or early 20s. She had served the chieftain in his household. She would now serve him forever. Once she volunteered, there was no going back. The commitment was absolute. From that moment until her death, her life was no longer her own. It belonged to the ritual. And the ritual had very specific requirements. The chieftain's body was placed in a temporary grave immediately after death. This was standard practice. The funeral preparations required time, and the body needed to be preserved while those preparations were completed. Ibn Fadlan described the temporary burial. A pit was dug. The body was placed inside with food, drink, and basic necessities. The pit was covered. The dead man would wait there while his people prepared to send him off properly. The preparation period lasted 10 days. During those 10 days, the Rus worked constantly. They sewed funeral garments. They prepared the ship that would carry the chieftain to the afterlife. They slaughtered animals, gathered wood, assembled everything needed for the ceremony. And during those 10 days, the slave girl lived a life she had never known before. Ibn Fadlan documented her transformation with evident fascination. From the moment she volunteered, she was treated as a person of status. She was given fine clothes to wear. She was given jewelry. She was given alcohol whenever she wanted it, and she wanted it constantly. She was assigned 2 other slave girls to attend her. These girls followed her everywhere, served her every need, watched over her at all times. They were her servants now. The slave had become a mistress. She spent those 10 days drinking and singing. Ibn Fadlan used the word joyful to describe her demeanor. She showed no fear, no hesitation, no regret. She behaved like someone looking forward to what was coming, not someone dreading it. Whether this joy was genuine is impossible to know. Perhaps she truly believed she was going to paradise. Perhaps the alcohol kept her in a state of constant intoxication that prevented clear thought. Perhaps she had been conditioned from childhood to see this as the greatest honor a slave could receive. Or perhaps the joy was performance, maintained because she knew the alternative was worse. Ibn Fadlan did not explore these possibilities. He reported what he saw: a young woman who seemed happy, who sang and laughed, who drank cup after cup of alcohol, who counted down the days to her death as if counting down to a celebration. The 10 days also involved rituals that Ibn Fadlan described with evident discomfort. Each day she was taken to the tents of the chieftain's closest companions. Each man received her as a guest. Each man, according to Ibn Fadlan's carefully chosen words, lay with her. When he was finished, he would speak specific words to her. "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him." Ibn Fadlan recorded this phrase because it was repeated each time, by each man, a formula that transformed what was happening into an act of devotion to the dead chieftain. The girl was not being used for the men's pleasure, the formula insisted. She was carrying messages to the afterlife. Each encounter was a message of loyalty that she would deliver when she arrived. This continued for 10 days. Every day, different tents. Every night, different men. Every time, the same words. Ibn Fadlan did not record how many men were involved. He did not describe the girl's reactions during these encounters. He maintained the scholarly distance that characterized his entire account. But his word choices suggest discomfort, suggest that even a man who had witnessed much in his travels found this particular custom disturbing. The girl continued to drink. The girl continued to sing. The girl continued to show no outward sign of distress. On the 10th day, the preparations were complete. The ship was ready. The chieftain's body had been retrieved from its temporary grave and prepared for its final journey. And the slave girl's journey was about to begin. The morning of the 10th day began with the ship. Ibn Fadlan described the vessel in detail. It had been dragged from the water onto land and placed on a platform of wood. Around it, the Rus had constructed a framework that would support the funeral pyre. The ship would not sail on water. It would sail on fire. The chieftain's body had been removed from the temporary grave. During the 10 days, it had been preserved by the cold, but decomposition had begun. Ibn Fadlan noted that the body had turned black. This disturbed him, but the Rus seemed unconcerned. The body's appearance did not matter. What mattered was that the spirit would soon be released. The body was dressed in funeral garments that had been sewn during the preparation period. Trousers, stockings, boots, a tunic, a caftan of brocade with gold buttons. The clothing was expensive, imported, the finest available. A dead chieftain should arrive in the afterlife looking like a chieftain. The body was placed inside a tent that had been constructed on the ship's deck. The tent was furnished with cushions and coverings. Food was placed beside the body: bread, meat, onions, alcohol. Everything a man might need for a journey. Weapons were placed within reach: a sword, a knife, the instruments of a warrior's trade, available should they be needed on the other side. The animals came next. Ibn Fadlan listed them precisely. 2 horses, driven until they were sweating, then killed with swords. A hen and a rooster, a dog, a cow, all slaughtered, all placed on the ship or around it, their spirits released to accompany their master. The morning proceeded with systematic efficiency. The Rus knew exactly what they were doing. They had done this before. Each person had assigned tasks. The chieftain's relatives supervised. The community participated. And throughout the morning, the slave girl continued to drink. Ibn Fadlan observed her moving through the camp, cup in hand, singing the songs she had been singing for days. She went from tent to tent, saying what he described as farewells. She was taking leave of the living before joining the dead. The 2 slave girls who had attended her for 10 days stayed close. They would remain with her until the end. They were the last human connection she would have before the ritual claimed her. By midday, the ship was ready. The body was in place. The animals were slaughtered. The mourners were assembled. The final ceremony could begin. Near the ship, the Rus had constructed something that Ibn Fadlan described with particular attention. It was a structure resembling a door frame, wood posts with a lintel across the top. It stood alone, leading nowhere, framing nothing but air. The slave girl was brought to this structure. She was lifted by men who held her level with the lintel, high enough that she could see over the top. Then she was lowered, then lifted again, then lowered, 3 times in total. Each time she was raised, she spoke. Ibn Fadlan asked his interpreter to translate what she was saying. The first time she said, "I see my mother and my father." The second time she said, "I see all my dead relatives sitting." The third time she said, "I see my master sitting in paradise. Paradise is green and beautiful. With him are men and young servants. He is calling me. Let me go to him." The interpreter delivered these words without expression. Ibn Fadlan recorded them without commentary, but the implications were clear. The girl was seeing into the afterlife. She was seeing the place where she would soon arrive. She was seeing the master who waited for her there. Whether she actually saw these things is unknowable. Whether she believed she saw them is almost certain. She had been drinking for 10 days. She had been told for 10 days that paradise awaited her. She had been treated like royalty, fed the promise of eternal glory. And now she was being lifted above a threshold between worlds, her mind prepared by alcohol and ritual to see whatever she expected to see. The doorframe ceremony was not random. Throughout Norse culture, thresholds held supernatural significance. Doorways were boundaries between spaces, between states of being. A doorframe that led nowhere was a doorframe that led everywhere, to the realm beyond the physical, to the place where the dead waited. The girl saw her master calling. She asked to be taken to him. What happened next would grant that request. The slave girl was taken to the ship. She was helped aboard, onto the deck where the tent containing her master's body had been erected. At the entrance to the tent, she paused. Ibn Fadlan recorded that she removed 2 bracelets she was wearing and gave them to the old woman who waited there. This old woman had overseen the entire preparation period. She had supervised the sewing of the funeral garments. She had managed every detail of the ritual. The Rus called her the Angel of Death. Ibn Fadlan described her appearance: large, thick-bodied, dark-faced, grim. She was not young. She had been performing this role for years, perhaps decades. The title was hereditary, passed from woman to woman, a female priest of death in a society otherwise dominated by men. The slave girl gave her bracelets to the Angel of Death. Then she removed 2 anklets and gave those to the 2 slave girls who had attended her for 10 days. These were her final possessions, distributed as gifts to those who had served her during her last days of life. Then she was given another cup of alcohol. Ibn Fadlan described what happened as she drank. She sang over it, he wrote, drawing out the moment, the final cup she would ever taste. But her singing had changed. It was no longer joyful. It was hesitant, uncertain. The Angel of Death spoke to her harshly, urging her to drink quickly, to finish the cup, to enter the tent. The girl hesitated. She seemed, for the first time in 10 days, to understand fully what was about to happen. The alcohol, the singing, the ritual preparation had sustained a kind of trance state. Now, that state was breaking. The Angel of Death did not allow hesitation. She grabbed the girl's head and pushed her toward the tent entrance. She forced her inside. Ibn Fadlan could not see what happened within the tent, but he could hear. He heard the girl begin to scream. He heard men who had entered the tent with her. He heard what he described as sounds of struggle. Outside the tent, the remaining Rus began to make noise. They beat on their shields with wooden sticks. The purpose, Ibn Fadlan was told, was to prevent other slave girls from hearing what was happening. If they heard, they might not volunteer when their masters died. The screaming inside the tent continued. The beating on shields continued. Inside, the ritual was reaching its climax. Inside the tent, 6 men had entered with the slave girl. Ibn Fadlan did not see what happened, but he recorded what his informants told him. The 6 men were relatives of the dead chieftain. Their participation was required by custom. Each of them, in the enclosed space of that tent, beside the corpse of their kinsman, completed the ritual that the girl had been performing for 10 days. Each of them spoke the same words that had been spoken throughout the preparation period. "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him." When the 6 men had finished, they laid the girl beside the corpse of her master. 2 of them held her feet, 2 held her hands. The last 2 held the ends of a rope that was wrapped around her neck. The angel of death entered the tent. Ibn Fadlan described the instrument she carried, a thick-bladed dagger, wide and heavy. She approached the girl who lay pinned by 4 men, the rope around her neck held by 2 more. The 2 men with the rope began to pull. They pulled in opposite directions, tightening the rope, strangling her. At the same time, the angel of death began her work with the dagger. Ibn Fadlan used a specific phrase. She stabbed her repeatedly between her ribs. The verb suggests multiple thrusts, not a single killing blow. The angel of death was not simply executing the girl. She was performing a ritual that required both strangulation and stabbing simultaneously. The girl died by 2 methods at once. Her throat was closed by the rope, while her chest was pierced by the blade. Death came from both directions, ensuring that it came completely, ensuring that the spirit was fully released. When it was over, the 6 men exited the tent. The angel of death exited. The body of the slave girl remained inside, lying beside her master, positioned as a servant attending to her lord. The tent was sealed. The ship was ready for its final purpose. The closest male relative of the dead chieftain came forward. He was naked. He walked backward toward the ship, his face turned away from the vessel, one hand covering his posterior. In his other hand, he carried a piece of burning wood. Ibn Fadlan explained the significance of walking backward and covering himself. It was a form of protection, a way of separating himself from what was about to happen, ensuring that the spirits being released would not attach themselves to him. He reached the ship. Still facing away, he touched the burning wood to the pyre that had been constructed around and beneath the vessel. The dry wood caught immediately. Then other mourners came forward, each carrying their own burning brands. They touched fire to the ship from every direction. The flames spread rapidly, joining together, building into an inferno that engulfed the vessel within minutes. Ibn Fadlan described the intensity. A strong wind was blowing that day, fanning the flames, driving the fire to burn hotter and faster than it might have otherwise. The entire ship, the tent, the bodies inside, the sacrificed animals, all of it was consumed. A Russman standing near Ibn Fadlan made a comment that the diplomat recorded carefully. The man was comparing Rus burial practices to Arab practices. Arabs buried their dead in the earth, he said, where worms would consume them slowly. The Rus burned their dead, releasing them instantly. "We burn them in a moment," the man said, "and they enter paradise at once." He was proud of this. He believed the burning was merciful, efficient, a gift to the dead. He believed the fire was a vehicle, transporting the chieftain and his servant directly to the realm that awaited them. The fire burned for approximately an hour. When it finally subsided, nothing remained but ash and fragments. The ship was gone. The bodies were gone. The girl who had been singing that morning was gone. The Rus constructed a mound over the ashes, a burial marker that would indicate where a great man had departed for paradise. They placed a wooden post at the top of the mound and carved the chieftain's name into it. Then they dispersed. The ritual was complete. Life continued. Ibn Fadlan remained at the site for some time, recording his final observations, processing what he had witnessed. Then he too departed, carrying with him the account that would preserve this ritual for over 1,000 years. Throughout his account, Ibn Fadlan maintained scholarly distance. He recorded without excessive commentary. He described without explicit judgment. He was a professional doing his job. But his horror leaked through. He called the Rus the filthiest of God's creatures. He described their customs with phrases that conveyed disgust beneath the objective language. He recorded conversations that he clearly found disturbing. The moment with the Rus man comparing burial practices is revealing. Ibn Fadlan included the man's words, but did not endorse them. The juxtaposition suggests disagreement, a quiet refutation of the idea that burning a slave girl alive was any kind of mercy. His most explicit judgment came in his description of the girl's final moments. He noted her hesitation, her changed demeanor, the angel of death forcing her forward. He recorded the screaming, the beating on shields to drown it out, the explanation that other slave girls must not hear. That explanation was self-indicting. The Rus themselves knew that what happened inside that tent would terrify anyone who heard it clearly. They took steps to prevent that hearing. They were aware, on some level, that the ritual's horror might cause future slaves to resist volunteering. Ibn Fadlan did not need to add commentary. The details spoke for themselves. After witnessing the ritual, Ibn Fadlan remained among the Rus for several more weeks, completing his observations, gathering additional information for his report. But his account of the funeral is the longest and most detailed section of his surviving text. It was clearly the event that affected him most deeply. When he finally departed, traveling on toward the Volga Bulgars and his original mission, he carried with him memories that would shape his entire understanding of the northern peoples. He had seen human sacrifice performed by people who believed they were doing something holy. He had seen a young woman drink and sing for 10 days, then scream as she was killed. He had seen the angel of death work with her blade. He would write it all down, and that writing would survive when almost everything else about the Rus and their customs was lost. Ibn Fadlan's account was not immediately famous. It was one report among many, filed with the Abbasid bureaucracy, copied by scribes, stored in libraries. For centuries, it was known only to specialists who studied Arabic geographical literature. The manuscript's survival was precarious. The original is lost. What we have are copies of copies, preserved in various collections across the Islamic world and later Europe. Some sections may have been lost entirely. Others may have been altered through transcription errors. The section describing the Viking funeral survived intact. It was too vivid, too detailed, too different from anything else in the literature to be easily forgotten or carelessly copied. Scribes who reproduced the text paid attention to the passages about the Rus. They recognized that something unusual was being described. European scholars became aware of Ibn Fadlan's account in the 19th century when Arabic manuscripts began to be systematically translated. The passages about the Rus generated immediate interest. Here was an eyewitness description of Viking society, written by an outsider, someone with no investment in glorifying or demonizing the Northerners. But interest was accompanied by skepticism. Could the account be trusted? Was Ibn Fadlan exaggerating? Were there errors in transmission that had distorted his observations? Some scholars dismissed the funeral description as fantasy. Human sacrifice might have occurred occasionally, they argued, but the elaborate ritual Ibn Fadlan described seemed too theatrical, too perfectly detailed, too convenient for an author who wanted to shock his readers. Then archaeology began to confirm his account. In 1880, archaeologists excavating at Birka in Sweden discovered a burial that matched Ibn Fadlan's description in multiple respects. A man buried in a seated position, sacrificed animals around him, and near him, the skeleton of a woman who had clearly been killed at the time of burial. The woman's body showed signs of violence. Her neck vertebrae were damaged in a pattern consistent with strangulation. She had been positioned deliberately, placed in a posture of service relative to the male body. This was not an isolated find. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Viking-era graves were excavated across Scandinavia, Russia, and the British Isles. Again and again, archaeologists found evidence of human sacrifice, female bodies in male graves, signs of violent death, positioning that suggested servant relationships continuing into death. The Oseberg ship burial, discovered in 1904 in Norway, contained 2 female bodies. One was elderly, probably the primary occupant. The other was younger, in her 50s, and her skeleton showed a broken collarbone consistent with strangulation. She had been killed when her companion died. The Ballatier burial on the Isle of Man, excavated in 1946, contained a male skeleton buried with weapons and a female skeleton with the top of her skull sliced off by a sword blow. The woman had been kneeling when struck. She had been positioned at the man's feet. Each discovery added weight to Ibn Fadlan's account. The details he recorded, which had seemed excessive or invented, proved to match physical evidence from sites he could never have visited. He had described real practices accurately. Modern forensic techniques have pushed the evidence further. DNA analysis can now determine whether individuals buried together were related. Isotope analysis can reveal where people grew up, distinguishing locals from foreigners. Chemical analysis of bones can detect certain causes of death. These techniques have confirmed that sacrificed individuals in Viking graves were often slaves or prisoners, people from different regions than the primary occupants, people of lower status who had been killed to accompany their masters. Ibn Fadlan was right. What he described was real. The only question was how widespread the practice was. Ibn Fadlan witnessed one ritual involving one slave girl. How typical was this? The evidence suggests that human sacrifice at Viking funerals was not universal, but was far from rare. It was practiced primarily for wealthy and powerful individuals, chieftains, and warriors whose status demanded elaborate send-offs. Archaeological surveys have identified hundreds of Viking-era graves containing possible evidence of human sacrifice. Not all cases are certain. A body found in a grave might have died of natural causes before the primary occupant. Damage to bones might have occurred after death rather than causing death. Interpretation requires caution. But the cumulative evidence is substantial. Multiple graves with the same patterns. Female victims in male graves. Signs of violent death matching described methods. Positioning that makes sense only if the secondary individual was killed to serve the primary one. Written sources beyond Ibn Fadlan support the archaeological evidence. Norse sagas mention slaves being killed at funerals, though usually in less detail. Other Arab travelers made similar observations about the Rus, though none as comprehensive as Ibn Fadlan. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, described sacrifices at the Temple of Uppsala in Sweden. His account mentions human victims alongside animals, suggesting that ritual killing continued even as Christianity began to spread through Scandinavia. The practice appears to have declined during the 10th and 11th centuries as Viking societies converted to Christianity. Christian doctrine prohibited human sacrifice. Christian burial practices did not allow for servants to accompany their masters into death. The elaborate funeral rituals Ibn Fadlan witnessed gradually gave way to simpler Christian ceremonies. But for centuries before conversion, human sacrifice was an accepted part of Viking religious practice. Slaves, like the girl Ibn Fadlan observed, died by the hundreds, perhaps thousands, across the Viking world. Most of them left no trace. No Arab diplomat witnessed their deaths. No scribe recorded their final moments. They vanished into the fires that consumed them, their stories lost except for fragments preserved in bones and artifacts. The girl Ibn Fadlan described is unique only because we know about her. She represents countless others who died the same way without anyone to remember them. Of all the figures in Ibn Fadlan's account, the Angel of Death may be the most significant. She was not a random participant. She was a specialist, a woman whose role in society centered on death rituals. She supervised the preparation of funeral garments. She managed the 10 days of ritual preparation. She performed the killing itself. Ibn Fadlan described her as old, large, dark, grim-faced. His language suggests both physical presence and psychological intensity. She was not someone to be defied. When the slave girl hesitated, the Angel of Death forced her forward. The title was hereditary. Other women in the camp had learned the role from predecessors and would teach it to successors. The Angel of Death was an institution, not an individual. This suggests a level of formalization that supports the idea of widespread practice. The Vikings did not improvise human sacrifice. They had developed rituals, protocols, specialists. The Angel of Death was trained for her work, experienced in its performance, respected or feared because of her function. Her gender is significant. Viking society was dominated by men. Warriors, chieftains, kings were male, but the person who actually killed sacrificial victims was female. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of a female priesthood. The Angel of Death may have served religious functions beyond funerals, performing rituals that required feminine power or knowledge. Women in Norse mythology often possessed magical abilities that men lacked. The vulva, or seeress, was an important figure in Viking religion. Others interpret the Angel of Death's role more pragmatically. She did what men did not want to do themselves. She handled the deaths that were necessary, but spiritually dangerous. Her gender may have been a form of protection for the male community, allowing them to benefit from the sacrifice without directly performing it. Whatever her cultural significance, her practical role is clear. She killed. She had killed before. She would kill again. When Ibn Fadlan saw her, she was simply doing her job. The slave girl has no name in Ibn Fadlan's account. She is identified only by her status and her fate. She was a slave. She volunteered. She died. Her anonymity is typical of how history treats slaves. They were property, counted in inventories, traded in markets, but rarely recorded as individuals. We know the chieftain was important because his funeral required such elaborate preparation. We know nothing about the girl except how she spent her final 10 days. Her decision to volunteer was the starting point of Ibn Fadlan's narrative, but was it really a decision? The question is impossible to answer with certainty. Ibn Fadlan described the volunteering as if it were genuine. The girl was asked, and she answered. But the context complicates any simple interpretation. She was a slave. Her master was dead. In the absence of the ritual, her fate was uncertain. She might be inherited by the master's relatives, continuing in servitude. She might be sold, separated from everything familiar. She might face treatment worse than what she had experienced. The ritual offered certainty. It offered status, however brief. It offered, according to the beliefs she had been taught, passage to paradise. It offered an end to a life that may have contained little hope for improvement. When she volunteered, was she choosing death? Or was she choosing the best available option from a set of bad alternatives? The 10 days of preparation add complexity. She was treated like royalty. She drank and sang and showed apparent joy. But she was also passed from man to man, told each time that she was carrying messages of love to her dead master. The morning of the 10th day, she was lifted over the doorframe and described visions of paradise. She saw her master calling to her. She asked to be taken to him. Then, aboard the ship, she hesitated. She seemed suddenly uncertain. The angel of death had to force her forward. What changed? The alcohol may have worn off enough to allow clear thought. The reality of death, immediate rather than abstract, may have broken through the ritual preparation. She may have realized, finally, what was about to happen to her. But it was too late. There was no mechanism for withdrawal. The ceremony was in motion. The community's spiritual needs required her death. Her hesitation was overcome by force. She screamed inside the tent. The Rus beat their shields to prevent others from hearing. They knew she was not going willingly. They had to drown out the sounds of her resistance. The Rus who participated in this ritual believed they were doing something holy. This is essential to understanding what Ibn Fadlan witnessed. They were not sadists enjoying cruelty for its own sake. They were not murderers in the conventional sense. They were believers performing a religious obligation, sending an honored leader to the afterlife with the servants and companions he would need. The chieftain had lived well. He deserved to continue living well after death. The slave girl would ensure his comfort in paradise. The animals would provide transportation and companionship. The weapons would allow him to maintain his warrior status. Every element of the ritual had meaning. The doorframe represented the threshold between worlds. The fire released spirits from physical bodies. The angel of death served as the agent of transition, her blade and rope the instruments of transformation. The Rus man who spoke to Ibn Fadlan about burial practices was sincere. He genuinely believed that burning was superior to burial, that the chieftain and his slave entered paradise instantly, that the ritual was an act of honor and kindness. This sincerity does not excuse what happened. The slave girl's terror inside that tent was real, regardless of what her killers believed. Her death was murder, regardless of its religious context. But the sincerity complicates simple condemnation. The Rus were not evil in their own understanding. They were faithful, performing the obligations their religion demanded, serving their dead as their culture required. History is full of such complications. Acts that seem monstrous in retrospect were performed by people who believed themselves righteous. Religious obligation has justified innumerable horrors. Sincere faith has motivated sincere atrocities. The Rus believed. That belief did not save the slave girl. Within 2 centuries of Ibn Fadlan's visit, the Rus had converted to Christianity. The funeral rituals he witnessed disappeared, replaced by Christian burial practices that prohibited human sacrifice. The conversion was gradual and uneven. Different regions converted at different times. Some elements of pagan practice persisted alongside Christianity for generations. The complete elimination of Viking religious traditions took centuries. But human sacrifice ended relatively quickly. It was one of the practices that Christian missionaries most strongly condemned. As Viking rulers accepted baptism and aligned themselves with Christian kingdoms, they abandoned the rituals that marked them as pagans. The slaves who would have been sacrificed instead lived out their natural lives. They remained slaves, their material conditions unchanged, but they were no longer killed when their masters died. This was not humanitarian progress in any modern sense. Christian societies practiced their own forms of violence and oppression. Slavery continued throughout medieval Europe. The elimination of human sacrifice did not indicate newfound respect for human life in general. But the specific horror that Ibn Fadlan witnessed, the killing of slaves to accompany their masters into death, that horror ended. The fires still burned. The bodies no longer included living victims. Ibn Fadlan's account survived because it was useful to scholars. It provided information about northern peoples that no other source contained. It documented trade routes, political structures, social customs. It was preserved because it was valuable. The passage about the funeral was preserved along with everything else. Scribes copied it without censorship, recognizing its importance even if they found its content disturbing. When European scholars rediscovered the account in the 19th century, the funeral passage attracted the most attention. It confirmed that human sacrifice had been practiced among the Vikings, a question that had been debated based on incomplete evidence. The passage also attracted controversy. Some scholars argued that Ibn Fadlan had exaggerated or misunderstood what he saw. Others accepted his account but minimized its implications, suggesting that such rituals were rare exceptions rather than standard practice. Archaeology resolved the debate. The evidence supported Ibn Fadlan. He had described real practices accurately. Today, his account is central to Viking studies. It is taught in universities, cited in academic papers, referenced in popular histories. It has been translated into dozens of languages. It has been adapted into fiction, most notably Michael Crichton's novel Eaters of the Dead, and its film adaptation, The 13th Warrior. But adaptations tend to sanitize. The slave girl's story is difficult material for popular entertainment. Her experience was not heroic or redemptive. She was not a protagonist who overcame adversity. She was a victim who died terrified, while men beat shields to cover her screams. Her story survives because a diplomat from Baghdad happened to be present and happened to write down what he saw. Without Ibn Fadlan, she would be one of countless anonymous sacrifices, traces in bones that archaeologists might misinterpret. With Ibn Fadlan, she has a narrative. Not a name, not a history, but a sequence of events that preserved her final 10 days in detail. It is not much. It is more than most slaves received. Ibn Fadlan's account is detailed, but not complete. He recorded what he observed and what informants told him. He did not have access to private conversations, internal experiences, or contexts that the Rus did not share. What did the slave girl actually think during those 10 days? Ibn Fadlan saw her drinking and singing. He interpreted this as joy, but he could not know what thoughts accompanied the external behavior. Did she believe in the paradise she described seeing from the doorframe? Or were her visions the product of alcohol, suggestion, and the desperate need to find meaning in approaching death? What happened inside the tent during those final moments? Ibn Fadlan heard screaming. He was told about the 6 men and their ritual, but the details of her experience inside that enclosed space are lost. Who was she before she became the chieftain's slave? Where did she come from? How did she end up in servitude among the Rus? Ibn Fadlan did not ask these questions or did not record the answers. The angel of death is equally mysterious. How did she feel about her role? Did she see herself as a priestess serving essential religious functions? Did she struggle with the killing, or had repetition made it routine? Ibn Fadlan saw the surface. The interior lives of participants remained hidden. We can speculate but not know. In the year 921, on the banks of the Volga River, a young woman died in a ritual that her killers believed would send her to paradise. She had been a slave. Her master, a Viking chieftain, had died 10 days earlier. She had volunteered, or been selected, or been pressured into accompanying him to the afterlife. For 10 days, she drank and sang, and was treated like royalty. She was passed from man to man, each one telling her to carry his message of devotion to her dead master. She was lifted above a doorframe and described visions of the paradise that awaited her. On the morning of the 10th day, she boarded the ship that would carry her master to the next world. She hesitated at the tent where his body lay. An old woman called the Angel of Death forced her inside. Inside the tent, 6 men completed the ritual that had been performed throughout the preparation period. Then the Angel of Death strangled her with a rope while stabbing her repeatedly with a blade. She died by 2 methods at once, ensuring the complete release of her spirit. Outside the tent, the other Rus beat their shields with sticks, creating noise to cover her screams, preventing other slave girls from hearing what happened to those who volunteered. Her body was left beside her master's. The tent was sealed. The ship was burned. Within an hour, nothing remained but ash and memory. An Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan witnessed everything. He wrote it down in a report that would survive for 1100 years, preserving details that no other source contains, providing evidence that would later be confirmed by archaeology. The slave girl has no name. Her life before those final 10 days is unknown. She exists in history only as a figure in a ritual, defined entirely by her death. But she existed. She was real. She lived and she died, and someone recorded her dying so that we could know what happened to women like her in a culture that treated them as property to be disposed of according to religious custom. She was not the only one. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of slaves died in similar rituals across the Viking world. Most left no trace except bones that archaeologists might one day excavate. She left a story. Not her story, but a story about her. Not her voice, but the voice of a man who watched and wrote and preserved what he saw. It is not enough. It is what we have. If you found this valuable, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share with anyone who needs to understand what history actually contained, not the sanitized versions, but the documented reality. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. The slave girl died 1100 years ago. We know about her because one man happened to be watching. We remember her because he happened to write it down. She was passed to every man before the fire. Then the fire took her.